Okay, this is the second part of the first lecture on the 20th century. We're now going to cover the start of World War II. I forgot to talk briefly about the end of World War I and the rise of the Soviet Union, so let me just do that briefly and then we will start. So the Russians had a revolution in March of 1917, but that actually only created a republic. The Russian government was not communist yet. You have to wait until October of 1917, which is actually November in our calendar. But so November of 1917 to have the communist revolution. Once Russia becomes communist, although it has huge costs, it will manage to defend itself when other countries, Britain, France, America, and Japan invade communist Russia to overthrow the communist government. The Russians kick them out and eventually, establish a stable communist government. Although stable is perhaps not the right word for the people living there, because roughly 7 million people at least will die of starvation under Stalin's plans to rapidly industrialize Russia. But the story of Russia actually is in the purview of European history, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. So, all right, here we go. World War II. Why does World War II happen? At the end of World War I, 1918, you have the Versailles Peace Conference, or the Paris Peace Conference. No, Versailles. Paris? It doesn't matter, but you have the peace conference. And Germany is forced to pay huge reparations to France. Austria-Hungary is dismantled. Russia, which was defeated, its territories that the Germans got is basically given up and new countries are created. The Ottoman Empire is also divvied up, and out of the wreckage, the Turkish Republic will emerge, and other European colonies will emerge in the former Arab territories. Okay, here we go. After World War I, 1918, as the Germans are beginning to pay back reparations, they realize they don't want to do this, which is kind of understandable. It's not too happy. So they try to find a way to stick it to the French by not paying the reparations, or by trying to somehow figure out a way to screw over the French. And one of the things they do is they print huge amounts of paper money, and what this means is it causes a hyperinflation in Germany. Now, for some odd reason, and I don't know why, the Germans believe that this hyperinflation is what led to the rise of the Nazis. This is actually wrong. I mean, but because the Germans believe this, a lot of people around the world also believe this, but this is wrong, okay? The hyperinflation that starts in Germany in 1921 or so, as they're trying to pay off the reparations, actually comes to an end by 1923, especially by 1924. The whole shebang comes to an end, and that is because what is called the Dawes Plan is put into effect. So you can't blame the rise of Hitler, which happens in 1933, to the hyperinflation, which basically happened, and it's at its peak in like 1922, 1923. And the whole thing is over by 1924. So, there's a 9-year time lag. You can't get elected for complaining about something that happened 9 years ago. So Hitler gets elected for a different reason. And the reason is the Great Depression. Anyway, back to the topic. So the hyperinflation happens in Germany because they're trying to stick it to the French. They don't want to pay the reparations. Sorry. All right. This hyperinflation is resolved with the Dawes Plan. What is the Dawes Plan? Here's the Dawes Plan. The United States is going to lend money to Germany. Germany will then take this money and then pay back the reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France then in turn take this money and uses that to pay off the loans that they borrow from the US during World War I. So you have a loop that goes around and around. The money goes from the US to Germany, Germany to Britain and France, and then from Britain and France back to the US. And as long as this loop was in place, everything seemed hunky-dory, and it looked like the whole thing was going to be okay. So the new Weimar Republic, the new republic that emerged in Germany after the defeat of Imperial Germany, seemed like it was, going to survive. Well, it didn't. It didn't survive because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, as many people know, starts in New York City. It starts in New York in 1929. And this Great Depression basically destroys the banks of New York City, Wall Street banks. Why? That is because stock prices in America, because of the the boom, the Roaring '20s, was going so high that banks began to borrow money and use that borrowed money to buy stocks. When you use borrowed money to buy stocks and the stock price goes down, well, you can't pay off the borrowed money. And so banks basically collapse left and right. And when banks collapse left and right, people who had their deposits in those banks suddenly got screwed because they couldn't get their money. This is the reason why when FDR takes over, one of the things he implements is federal deposit insurance, so that if an ordinary person has money in the bank and when the bank fails, then that money goes back to him, at least up to, I think now $250,000 is assured. Anyway, back to the topic. So when the Wall Street banks collapse, well, by definition, they cannot lend to Germany because the banks are gone. So when they can't lend to Weimar Germany, can the Germans pay back the loans to Britain and France? Well, it becomes really, really hard, right? So when the British and the French don't get the loans, don't get the reparations from Germany, can they pay off the loans to the U.S.? Well, it becomes really, really hard. And so next thing you know is that the Great Depression, which starts in New York City, spreads not only to the rest of America, but it also jumps to Germany. And then from Germany, it jumps to Britain and France. And next thing you know, you have a global depression. The Great Depression is a global, worldwide depression of all the capitalist countries. The only country that is not affected by the Great Depression effectively is Russia. And that is because Russia is communist and is not, it is not trading with the West that much. Does that make sense? Okay. So what happens? Well, when people don't have jobs and the Great Depression, so when the Great Depression happens, people don't have jobs. And when people don't have jobs, they become really unhappy. When you have hyperinflation, what this does is, as long as you have a job, your employer is going to pay you, money so that you can keep on living. But if you're don't have a job and you're reliant on a pension, the hyperinflation basically blows that pension away and old people get screwed. When old people get screwed, they get unhappy, but they generally don't run around the streets, burning things down. But when young people don't have jobs and they're hungry and they're unhappy, then yes, they basically will run around the streets and smash things and burn things sometimes. So that's one of the major problems of the Great Depression, 1930s. And because it looked like capitalism as a system was collapsing and communism was the only system that was working, people began to say, maybe capitalism isn't going to work, right? There's got to be some other system. And some other system was represented, one, by communism, Russian communism. So what is the big idea behind communism? Well, it's very simple. The idea here is that, all the resources, there should be no private property. All the resources will be controlled by the state. And instead of having the individuals, who own products basically decide where, resource should go, the state should decide, and the state should decide how much people get paid, et cetera, et cetera. So the government basically does everything for you. Well, there was a third alternative. The third alternative was fascism. Starting in 1922, Benito Mussolini takes over Italy. So Italy becomes fascist before the Great Depression and starts to experiment with fascist policies. So big question here is, what is fascism? And here, I think what you need to understand is the idea behind fascism. And the best way to think about this is not to think in terms of, what are the things that you do to become fascist, the easiest way to do this is to think, what is the goal of a fascist? And the answer is the goal of a fascist is to go to war. Fascists think that war is good. The fasces is an ancient Roman symbol. It's a bundle of sticks with an X attached to it, and it's a symbol of authority or a symbol of power. So the ancient Roman lictors basically carried these fasces around, and the fasces, because it's a Roman symbol, is all over the place. So if you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, you will see Abraham Lincoln's hands resting on two fasces. And if you see images of the U.S. Congress, well, on the two sides of the speaker, when the guy is speaking at Congress, there are two fasces as well. Okay. So Mussolini takes this symbol, the Roman symbol, the fasces, and uses that for the symbol of his entire political movement, fascism. And Mussolini basically says the pacifists are wrong, that war is good, that the ancient Roman tradition, the medieval knightly chivalric tradition is correct, that war is good. And why is war good? War is good because it gives people's lives meaning. Instead of being individualistic, you get to subsume yourselves for the overall goal of the entire nation. So you live for something greater than yourself. You live for the glory of your nation, and it purifies the soul. Now, I mean, this is all kind of insane, but this is what fascists actually believe. So unless you actually have people running around who actually think this way, that war is good and that it purifies the soul, and that war is, it subsumes you within the nation and all that, then you're not really a fascist, right? People use that phrase fascist around sort of like all over the place, but that's the actual definition of fascism. So what this means is that any means necessary to win wars is acceptable for a fascist. You can use anything you can as long as you win the war. So if you're going to use capitalist means to, make your country stronger, use capitalist means. If you're going to use communist means to make your country stronger, then use communist means. It's a very flexible idea. And what the fascists want to do is they want to make sure that in order for the people to be willing to fight for the country as a whole has to ensure, or the fascist party who is leading the country has to ensure that the various parts of the country is no longer, screwing over other people within the country. Right. So in a sense, it is just as, it's nationalism and all that, that's true, but, the goal is different, right? There's no goal in nationalism that says you have to go to war. I mean, it's just not there. But in fascism, there is. Okay. So Mussolini is running around in 1922, and since 1922, he's been experimenting with fascist ideas. And so after the Great Depression, you have in Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party who begin to say, we are also fascists too, and we are going to do the same thing. We're not going to believe in capitalism, and we're going to try and attempt a different alternative. Since private property seems to motivate people more than no property, and we're going to keep private property. But since a huge gap between the rich and the poor pisses people off too, then we're also going to use communist means to make sure that there's no huge gap between the rich and the poor in our fascist country. So you see how fascism basically takes various aspects of whatever works and throws it in to make your country stronger. Okay. Now, what makes Hitler interesting is that he goes one step beyond this. And he actually begins to talk about why Germany lost World War I and what his ultimate grand plan is. And because of this, he becomes very popular, and the Nazi Party in 1933 becomes the largest political party in the Weimar Republic. Now, in any constitutional system, when you the largest, so in a constitutional system, in a parliamentary system, when the largest political party wins the most votes, then the leader of that when that largest political party has the right to basically say, our leader should be the leader of our country, the prime minister. And that's precisely what happens. Hitler gets appointed as the Prime Minister of Germany in 1933, the Chancellor of Germany, because his party wins the most votes. So the bastard gets elected. There's just no question about this, right? So what was he saying? So here we go. Here is Hitler's master plan. Hitler basically says, okay, why did the Great Depression get so bad? Why are we in such bad shape? We are in such bad shape because the West has betrayed us. What does he mean by this? Here's what he means. The Great Depression happens in 1929. In 1930, the United States, and then in 1931, Great Britain, respond to the Great Depression by raising tariffs. Instead of saying, hey, we are all capitalist countries, let's lower tariffs, let's do more free trade, let's help each other out so that the better parts of the world economy can help out the parts of the world economy that's doing not as well, the United States basically says, no, we're going to have the Smoot-Hawley tariff. We're going to jack up tariff rates so that other countries can't sell us their goods. Now, the idea behind the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 is that if foreigners can't sell to the American people, then American factories will have to produce goods and the American people will have to buy those American goods. And by definition, over time, the American economy will get back on track because the American factories are making things once again. So in the long run, this might actually work out. But what happened is that the next year, Britain responds by creating the sterling zone. It basically says that unless you use the pound sterling, so effectively unless you're part of the British Empire or within its orbit, you cannot trade with Britain. So what just happened? 1930, 1931, the largest economy in the world, the United States, suddenly cut itself off from the rest of the world. And then the next year in 1931, Great Britain and the British Empire, which controlled roughly a quarter of the global landmass, also suddenly said, unless you're part of the British Empire, you can't trade with us. And that meant that the Germans, whose economy was tanking, couldn't export to the US or to the British Empire. And it made the German economy, the German Depression, even worse. So if the Great Depression basically made about a quarter of the American workers unemployed, well, the Great Depression made 1/3 of the German workers unemployed. That's actually worse than America. The Great Depression actually had a worse impact on Germany than the United States, which is kind of scary. And you can kind of understand why people got desperate. So Hitler says, so if the West is going to betray us and they're not going to trade with us, that means then that we need to be like America or like Britain. We need to have enough space, enough landmass, enough population. Well, Germany's population was large enough, but we need to have enough resources and markets within our own borders so that we can be self-sufficient, so that we don't have to rely on foreign trade, which kind of makes sense. So if you look at a map of Europe, which direction should Germany go? West or east? And it's kind of obvious. If you want more landmass, you got to go east. And so Hitler's grand plan is, and he writes this in his book, Mein Kampf, and it's kind of crazy book, but whatever. But he writes this in a book and says, what we want to do is we need to go east, take over Russia and the huge territory all the way up into the Ural Mountains, and if not more, and then turn all that area to the east, big giant farmland. And then take that goods from the farmland, and the German factories in what is today's Germany will produce all the manufactured goods and then sell it to the farmers in the new, in the former Russia, in the eastern part of his new Germany. In other words, what Hitler wants to do is he wants to make Germany into a continental-sized country like the United States. The United States east of the Mississippi is the industrial part of the country, and west of the Mississippi is the agricultural part of the country. And west of the Mississippi, when it produces all that food, they ship it to the east, and when the east produces all those goods, the factory goods, then they ship that west, and the food and the products are exchanged. And Hitler's grand plan is to do exactly that. So when World War II starts, he makes a short quip, and one of the things he says is that the Volga River is going to be his Mississippi. So, the Volga River is going to be what divides his future eastern part of Germany that produces food with his future western part of Germany that produces manufacturing goods. And just like in the 19th century, the United States exterminated, or they did ethnic cleansing of the American Indians and killed the American Indians and enslaved the blacks. Hitler's grand plan is to exterminate the Jews, because this is where he's crazy. He thinks the Jews were the people who stabbed Germany in the back at the end of World War I, and that's why Germany lost, which is totally false. And he's going to enslave the Russian people. So that's his grand plan, right? He basically wants to do what the U.S. did in the 19th century, but do it in the 20th century. Now, obviously, we now know. I mean, even back then in 1930s, people knew that what we did was wrong. That's why we fought the Civil War. Enslaving entire people is wrong. I mean, you can't enslave, people like that. That's the new value that the United States has established. And by the 20th century, the idea that what we did to the American Indians was pretty awful was pretty confident, was pretty clear, right? By the 1930s, people were not saying, hey, we should kill Indians and take their land. I mean, that was no longer the case. But we began to realize our mistake. But Hitler's grand plan is that he's going to do this. When he talks about this plan, the people who actually know why Germany lost, and the reason why Germany lost World War I is because of the British blockade, basically think this and go, okay, what he's talking about, all this race stuff, is nonsense and stupid, but the idea that Germany should have this, economic hinterland and, a continental economy so that it can no longer be blockaded like happened in World War I, and that the German economy can recover if you have that, seemed to make sense. And so that's why when the Nazi Party became the largest political party in 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. Now, once he's the Chancellor of Germany and the President of Germany dies, so Chancellor is like the Prime Minister. And the President was like the Emperor of Germany, right? So when the President of Germany dies, Hitler then becomes elected as the new President of Germany, and in one person, he is both the President and Prime Minister. And that concentrates so much power into his hands that he effectively becomes the dictator of Germany. And that's how you get Nazi Germany, a dictatorship. So there you go, right? Obviously, for World War II, most people basically say that Germany is at fault. Germany is at fault because it invaded Poland in September of 1939, and that sparked World War II. When Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declares war on Germany, and then eventually Russia joins the war because Germany declares war on Russia, and then the US and Germany go to war because Japan declares war on the US with Pearl Harbor. Not declares war, but Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and then declares war on the US. And that's how you get World War II. So the two countries that, threw the first punch is usually seen as the bad guys here, right? Nazi Germany and Japan. But what's going on is a global depression. And people around the world are suffering because the economy sucks. And the same thing is happening in Asia, that's happening in Europe as well. So Japan is also an industrial country that's capitalist. With the Great Depression of 1929, loads and loads of people are unemployed. There's a really high unemployment rate in Japan. So what happens is that the Kwantung Army, the Japanese army, or the South Manchurian Railway, the people who guard the South Manchurian Railway, so they're actually members of the Japanese army, but they're attached as guards of the railway. This is actually illegal. This was a right that the Japanese have inherited from the Russians. The Russians actually got this right from Qing China, and Japan just, after they won against the Russians in 1905, they kept that right. But the Japanese army in Manchuria basically ignore what the home country, what Tokyo says, what the home country is saying, and says, hey, since our economy sucks, what we need to do is we need to take over Manchuria. And once we take over Manchuria, we will have the raw materials necessary. We will have the land necessary. So if there's too many people in Japan and there's all these, unhappy poor farmers, then we can emigrate. We can send these poor farmers in Japan to Manchuria and take over the land in Manchuria. And the coal and the steel resources in Manchuria can be shipped back to Japan to, to fuel the Japanese industrialization. Now, this is where the Japanese were wrong. By 1850, by World War I, it was clear that what you really needed was oil and not coal. But that was not in their minds at the time. They didn't think of it that far ahead. Anyway, when Japan goes to war in Manchuria and takes over Manchuria, what happens is that the newspapers back home in Tokyo basically say, hey, we should support our troops. And when you have something like that, it becomes really hard for the government in Tokyo to say no to the requests for more supplies, more guns, more equipment, the tanks and cannons and all those kinds of things. So when the guards of the South Manchurian Railway, the Kwantung Army, a branch of the Japanese army, requests all this, Japan has to send it. And when Japan sends all those things, what that means is the factories that were idle are now working overtime to pump out all those war goods and ship it to Manchuria. And so, although the Manchurian incident, when the Japanese army goes out in 1931, is initially starts off as, kind of like a risky venture, and the people in Tokyo are like, well, the government people in Tokyo are like, why are we doing this? We should probably put an end to it. By 1933, it gets Japan out of the Great Depression. And it works. And once Japan gets out of the Great Depression, now it becomes clear. The military begins to say, hey, it's us. We, the military, saved the country from the Great Depression. You, the politicians, whether it was the more conservative Liberal Party, I mean, it's kind of crazy, or the more liberal Progressive Party, they actually named the more conservative Seiyukai, or the more progressive or liberal Minseito, right? You guys, whichever party it was, suck. You guys couldn't solve the Great Depression. We did. We want to say and how to run the country. And so the Japanese military begins to have a much larger say on how to run the country. And when you have the 226 incident in 1936, and a whole bunch of government leaders are assassinated, and the military launches its coup d'etat to try to take over, the other faction within the Japanese army basically clamped down on this and said, well, if this is ever going to happen, and the coup d'etat was launched by a small faction within the Japanese army that was allied with Japanese homegrown fascists, the main branch of the Japanese army says, well, we're not going to let this happen ever again. And if that means, we have to adopt fascist policies so that homegrown fascists can't, start coup d'etats against the government, then so be it. We, the military, will adopt fascist policies to make sure that the people on the right and people on the left can't complain about us. And that's precisely what happens. Starting in 1936, Japan basically becomes increasingly fascist because the military leadership and the civilian leaders that agrees with the military begin to implement fascist policies that mix both capitalist and communist techniques to make the country strong and to gear the country for a future war. So there you go. The war in Asia then actually starts before the war in Europe in 1937. So to explain this, you have to explain the more global story. And again, we talked about what happened in Germany. We talked about what happened in Japan. We talked about what happened in Britain. We talked about what happened in America. The last country we have to talk about is what's going on with Russia. So here we go. This is now the story of communist Russia. Stalin's main goal is to make sure that communism survives no matter what. He wants to make sure that communism survives no matter what. And what that means is then he has to industrialize Russia. Now, if you're going to industrialize Russia, and Stalin's idea is, look, Russia is like a massive country. It's like America. We don't need overseas colonies. We have enough. We have enough landmass so that all the raw materials and all the markets are inside Russia. So we can do this. We don't need a global communist revolution, as Karl Marx and his followers said. We can actually take a different path of communism in one country. Now, what this effectively means is that you're going to shift workers from the farms to the factories in the cities. So when you shift workers from the farms to the factories in the cities, the idea was the cities and the factories are going to build things like tractors. And then you move those tractors from the cities to the farms, and the farms will be able to then produce food at a more efficient rate so that nobody starves. Well, this doesn't work out too well. When all those Russian farmers are moved from the countryside to the city, and the city industrializes, and the countryside suddenly loses a whole bunch of people who don't know, a whole bunch of laborers, well, the factories don't produce the tractors in time, and the farms can't produce enough food. But since Stalin's goal is to industrialize Russia, whatever food is actually produced is, first going to the cities to make sure that the workers in the cities don't starve. What that means is, since there's not enough food being made because there's not enough workers in the farms, the people who are going to starve is going to be people in the countryside. And at least 7 million people will starve to death in Russia. And people are really, really unhappy about this. And Stalin knows this too. So he needs to buy time. So how is he going to buy time? Well, here's where it gets very nasty. When Stalin sees that the Great Depression has started in 1929 and all these countries in the West and the capitalist countries are in turmoil, Stalin's plan is pretty diabolical. Oh, what I will do is I will get all these countries to fight against each other. Then they won't have the energy to fight into Russia. See, Stalin hadn't forgotten the fact that in 1918, after 1918, Britain, France, the US, and Japan all sent troops to Russia to, destroy the Russian Revolution. So in order to prevent that, he's going to get all these countries to fight against each other. So what's one way to do that? Well, in the early 1930s, what was happening was the Spanish Civil War. There was a civil war in Spain. And you had two camps, the more conservative, which would eventually become fascist, Francisco Franco's group, and the more liberal Republican Spanish. So the more democratic capitalist countries were left-leaning, and they were beginning to send aid to the Spanish left. And so Stalin says, all right, then, we will support these guys. We will support the Spanish communists, who will then ally with the Spanish left. Why? Because Franco, who's becoming increasingly fascist, is getting aid from Italy and Nazi Germany. And so this conflict rages on, and all the people's attention, all the European attention is fixated on Spain, and nobody has the willpower or the desire to, try to invade Russia again. Well, when the war in Spain is over, what can you do next? Well, Stalin is hoping that Hitler is going to start a war between Germany and Britain and France once again. He's hoping things like, Czechoslovakia. When Hitler says the German inhabitants of Czechoslovakia should be part of Germany, not part of Czechoslovakia, and demands the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is the area where German-speaking people lived in Czechoslovakia. Stalin thought that this would instigate war between Germany and Britain and France. Well, on that one, it turns out that Neville Chamberlain was gutless, and when he meets Hitler in Munich, Chamberlain basically says, basically accedes to Hitler's demands and decides to throw Czechoslovakia under the bus in order to keep the peace, because in Britain and France, most people are not pacifists, but most people don't want war anymore, and they now think that war is bad. And as long as those people are, as long as that's the majority popular opinion, the elected representatives of Britain and France aren't going to overturn that and say, hey, let's go to war against Germany for Czechoslovakia. So Stalin basically then has to figure out another way to instigate war between Germany and Britain and France. And if Czechoslovakia isn't going to do it, then Stalin is going to throw Poland under the bus. And so in August of 1939, Stalin and Hitler meet and they come to a secret agreement. They basically sign the Nazi-Soviet pact. It's called a pact, but it's basically an alliance. And when Hitler invades Poland in September from the west, Stalin will invade Poland from the east. So Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia are actually allies at the start of World War II. Why does nobody declare war on Russia? And the answer here is because Stalin has spies all over the world. The guy who founded the Russian Revolution is Lenin. When Lenin died, he had two potential successors. One was Stalin, the guy who won, and the other guy was Leon Trotsky. And Leon Trotsky's idea was a global communist revolution. This is the idea that was the standard idea ever since Karl Marx, that it should be a global communist revolution. You need a global communist revolution because industrial countries like Britain and Germany will produce the industrial products, and agricultural countries like Russia will produce the food, and they can trade, and everybody will be happy that way. So that's why, Trotsky said we need to have a global communist revolution, and in order to do so, he began to create a global communist spy network. Trotsky is defeated by Stalin, and Trotsky is exiled and eventually killed in exile. I think he's killed by an ice pick in Mexico. But the spy network that was created survives intact. And so what happens is that, there is this spy network called the Cambridge Five. These are 5 people who got recruited from Cambridge University while they were university students in England, Cambridge, England. And because they're, from the very top level of British society, when they graduate from Cambridge University, they join the very top levels of British government. So even people like, you got people like Kim Philby, who's working for British intelligence, that's actually a communist spy and passing off information to Russia. And there are other communist spies, and all these communist spies basically say to the British leaders, and I would imagine that something similar is happening in France too, but they're saying to the leaders of Britain and France, hey, we can go to war against Germany, but fighting against both Germany and Russia is too much to, chew on. So let's just focus on Germany. So there you go. Something similar to this is, and that's why when Stalin invades the eastern half of Poland and then invades the 3 Baltic states and then tries to conquer Finland, nobody declares war on Russia, even though Russia is just as aggressive a country as Germany is after 1939 in terms of, conquering, non-threatening neighbors. The same thing is happening in Asia. So, Russia is a continental-sized country where, the western part faces Germany, but the eastern part faces China and Japan. In 1904-1905, Russia lost a war against Japan, and Stalin does not want to fight a two-front war between Russia and a two-front war where Russia is fighting against both Japan and Germany. So if the goal is to instigate war between capitalist countries, who is the logical country to instigate war between Japan? Who is the logical candidate to instigate war with Japan? And the first logical candidate is China. So what's going on in China is that there's actually a civil war. Ever since 1927, there's a civil war in China between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. The Chinese nationalist under Chiang Kai-shek increasingly becomes fascist. He basically adopts a whole bunch of fascist policies. The Chinese communists will eventually be led by Mao Zedong. The number 2 man is Zhou Enlai. Right? So Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists are fighting. When Japan starts the Manchuria, when Japan invades Manchuria and takes it over in 1931-33, Chiang Kai-shek, who is the nominal leader of China, says, don't worry about that. We should not worry about the conflict with Japan. We should focus on the conflict with the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek's argument goes something like this. Japan is a country of roughly 70 million people. At the time, it was roughly 70 million people. China is a country of roughly 400 million people. At the time, China was a country of roughly 400 million people. And Chiang Kai-shek's argument is, a country of 70 million people cannot win against a country of 400 million people. It might take 10 years, it might take 20 years, it might take 30 years. I don't know how long it'll take, but eventually the Japanese will lose. And when they lose, they will go back home. They will go back to Japan. That's why we don't have to worry about them. The Chinese communists are Chinese. They will never leave. They are Chinese. So what we need to do is we need to smash the Chinese communists first. This was Chiang Kai-shek's argument. Well, we actually don't know exactly why. I mean, one argument is that it's because of nationalism. But what happens is that when the Chinese communists are basically cornered at Xi'an, in northwestern China, the Chiang Kai-shek's own general calls him and says, my general, Chiang Kai-shek, we have cornered the communists. We're waiting for the final blow to finally wipe them off the face of this map. This is 1936. And Chiang Kai-shek is like, finally. And he gets on his airport and he lands in Xi'an. And when he lands in Xi'an, his own general pulls his gun and points it at Chiang Kai-shek's head and says, I can't take this any longer. We have to be good nationalists. We need to work together with the Chinese communists and fight against Japan. And Chiang Kai-shek is kept in house arrest for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, he comes out and finally agrees to an armistice, an alliance with the Chinese communists. And the United Front is made to fight against Japan. So here, nationalism wins. Well, why did this happen? Well, I think one of the reasons why this happened, well, so that's why Chiang Kai-shek decides to argue this. Why did the communists basically say, okay, we'll go with this? I think the reason why the communists went along with this is because Joseph Stalin's idea was that, hey, stop fighting against yourself. Go fight against Japan. Throw Chiang Kai-shek against Japan. Whatever humiliating deal you need to make with Chiang Kai-shek, make it, and end the internecine civil war. And so in 1936 December, the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists basically agreed to end the civil war and focus their efforts against Japan. And in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident happens and Japan and China go to full-scale war. So this is kind of ironic because by 1937, Japan is increasingly fascist. And by 1937, Chiang Kai-shek, who is the leader of China, the communists are the junior partners, Chiang Kai-shek is also increasingly fascist. So this is actually a war between two fascist states. And there is a bullet that's fired at the Marco Polo Bridge and it starts the war. We actually don't know who started that, who shot that bullet. It's like Lexington and Concord. Nobody knows who fired that first bullet. These things happen. Some people say that it was the Japanese, that there were some Japanese spies on the Chinese side and they shot at the Japanese troops. Some people believe this because the Japanese army in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, in 1931 did something similar to this. They actually blew up the railroad lines, but that was actually done by Japanese secret agents. That actually is true. But 1937, that's one allegation that the Japanese did it to this. Another allegation is Chiang Kai-shek's own soldiers. They couldn't, for whatever reason, control themselves, and a random shot was fired, and this started the war. And this is more closer to conspiracy theory, but it could very well be the case. It's like, the Japanese may have started. But another argument is that the Chinese communists actually went and shot at the Japanese troops to instigate the war between Japan and China because, that's Stalin's grand plan. And this in the end worked out best for the Chinese communists because what's going to happen is that Japan and China are going to go to war, and when Japan and China goes to war, the Japanese army is primarily going to fight against the Chinese nationalist army. The Chinese communist army basically does hit and run guerrilla attacks, and they do not fight against Japan. There's just one battle that they fight against Japan. It's called the 100 Regiments or the 100 Battalions Offensive, and it's an utter and total disaster. And the war is basically fought between the Japanese and the Chinese nationalists. And unlike what Stalin had initially hoped, this war is lopsided. The Chinese basically lose pretty much every single battle. As far as I know, there's not a single major battle that Japan loses in China. And the reason is pretty simple. The Japanese side has airplanes, tanks. And the Chinese nationalist side doesn't have that many airplanes and tanks. So guess what? The side that has airplanes and tanks is going to win against the side that doesn't have airplanes and tanks. It's really that simple. The Chinese tried to use trench warfare tactics of World War I, but when you have airplanes and tanks, these trench warfare tactics don't work. Atrocities are committed on both sides. Probably the most famous one is it's called the Rape of Nanking, or the Battle of Nanjing. But what happened here is it's just really bad. But here's what happened. So this is 1937 winter, the winter of 1937-1938. Chiang Kai-shek has basically created a big giant trench around Shanghai to fight against Japan. He's hoping with his German advisors. In 1937, Nazi Germany is advising Chiang Kai-shek. See what I mean by, Chiang Kai-shek is fascist. But, Chiang Kai-shek has got these German advisors, and they say, we have to build these trenches, and we're going to fight, World War I style. Well, the Japanese have tanks and airplanes, so the trench warfare doesn't work, and they break out. So the Japanese army then begins to march towards Nanjing, the capital of China. Nanjing and Shanghai are not that far apart. What does Chiang Kai-shek do? Does he stand ground and say, we have to defend our capital to the last? And the answer is no. He basically tells his general, hey, defend Nanjing, this is our capital, do what you must, and runs away. Chiang Kai-shek runs away to Wuhan. Later, when Wuhan is attacked, Chiang Kai-shek will run away from Wuhan to Chongqing. But anyway, so when Chiang Kai-shek runs away, the general who's in charge of defending Nanjing sees the Japanese army marching towards Nanjing and thinks, okay, I'm not going to be able to win this. And says to his troops, yeah, okay, do what you can, and runs away. So instead of actually, taking his troops and having an orderly withdrawal or actually fighting against the Japanese for a delay and then a withdrawal, he just basically runs away too. So the Chinese troops left behind basically don't know what to do. And what that means is some of the troops fight to the bitter end, bravely. Some of the troops surrender. It's like, can't win, surrender, it's over. And some other troops think, well, what this means is I should get out of my uniform and attack the Japanese from behind as guerrillas. So now you got to think of this from the Japanese perspective, right? The Japanese army is marching towards Nanjing, and some Chinese troops are like fighting like crazy. Others are giving up like really easily. And then there are people shooting at you from behind wearing civilian clothes. At which point you go, all right, what the heck is going on? Like, who is the enemy? Why are civilians shooting at us, right? I mean, people can't figure out what's going on. So when that kind of thing happens, what do you think was happening? What's going to happen is you're going to shoot first and ask questions later, right? Because you're being attacked from all sides. You're being attacked from the front, and you're being attacked from behind, and you're being attacked by people in uniform, and you're being attacked by people out of uniform. And so although we don't actually know the exact number of casualties, I mean, there's probably no question that non-competents got involved, got caught up in this, and large number of people died. What is the large number of non-combatants died? What is the actual number of the people who got killed at Nanjing? This is a source of contention. The Chinese Communist Party today says that 300,000 people died at Nanjing. And whenever I hear this number, I'm going like, what? I mean, that's just insane. First of all, if you count the number of soldiers who died, then that's just BS, because this is war. You don't count number of soldiers who die. You can count the number of non-combatants. You can count the number of prisoners of war. You can count the number of civilians that got killed. That's actually reasonable to say that's an atrocity. That's good. All right. So were there 300,000 non-combatants? And the answer is no. We know from Western estimates that the city of Nanjing had 250,000 people. So it's kind of hard to kill 300,000 people when there's only 250,000 people in the city of Nanjing. And not only that, when the battle was over, and the Japanese then do a head count of the number of people in Nanjing, and they count roughly 200,000 civilians in Nanjing. So there's roughly 50,000 civilians that are missing. Did they all die? Well, this is kind of hard to tell. After the Battle of Nanjing was over, the population of Nanjing actually gradually goes back up and recovers to roughly 250,000, 250,000 people. If there was such a huge number of atrocity, then I doubt the people would return to the city of Nanjing. But as I said earlier, because of the conditions on the ground, there's no question that atrocities did happen. So how many prisoners of war, how many civilians got killed? It is very hard to guess. I would actually, the Japanese government position is we don't know, but we're sorry that this happened. As a historian, you'd actually have to come up with some sort of estimate. I don't think all 50,000 people who left the city were massacred, because if that happened, then all those people, then the population would not recover. But if you include prisoners of war that probably got killed, and that probably did happen, I wouldn't be surprised if 30,000 people who were non-combatants perished at the Battle of Nanjing. And that's bad. I mean, 30,000 people is like a really large number, right? You don't have to like exaggerate like the Chinese Communist Party. But that really was a tragedy. But, even bigger tragedies are going to happen, because what happens is after Nanjing falls and, Chiang Kai-shek doesn't give up, the Japanese army says, all right, well, then we got to take Wuhan. And the Japanese army then marches down from Manchuria and Beijing down towards Wuhan, and from Nanjing west towards Wuhan. So as the Japanese army is marching down the North China Plain, Chiang Kai-shek and then the nationalists basically think of a plan to break the dikes of the Yellow River and slow the pace of the Japanese coming down to attack Wuhan. So if your goal is to slow the Japanese by breaking the dikes of the River, I mean, this is just so insane. What you can't do is you can't tell people that you're doing this. So Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Army basically break the dikes of the River without telling anybody. And lo and behold, the entire North China Plain is flooded. And the civilians who haven't heard about this basically panic, and their homes are washed away. Millions of people become homeless. 800,000 people basically perish with the flood. 800,000 people. And Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists basically pump out a huge stream of propaganda saying that the Japanese army broke the dikes of the river, but even at the time, this propaganda didn't stick. So this is. Didn't work. And so what happens to the Japanese army? Well, when the river floods, the Japanese army basically just goes to high ground, wait for the flood to subside, and then they resume the march. And so this disaster that was man-made basically doesn't really do much to slow the Japanese to attack Wuhan. And when Wuhan is being attacked by the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek runs away once again to Chongqing. Now, when Wuhan finally falls, here's what happens. Chiang Kai-shek was right. A country of 70 million people can't win against a country of 400 million people. The Japanese army runs out of troops. They have conquered a vast area of China, but the number of troops is simply not large enough. And the Japanese can't pursue any further up the Yangtze River towards Chongqing. When they can't do that, when they don't have army troops to march towards the enemy capital because it's so far inland, the Japanese army will begin to drop. What do you call it? They will bomb the city of Chongqing to try to get Chiang Kai-shek to surrender. But Chiang Kai-shek refuses to surrender and says he will fight on. All right, but it's clear, right? Stalin's goal was to get Japan and China to fight, but Japan is not exhausted. Japan just beats China handily, and China is basically now, stuck in Chongqing, and the Japanese army is, essentially victorious in China. So, what must Stalin do? Well, here's the thing. Oh, so before Stalin. So Stalin, after, while he's industrializing, is preparing to eventually betray Hitler. Right? Hitler is fighting a war against Germany, and Hitler's Germany is fighting a war against Britain and France. September 1939. 1940, summer of 1940, Hitler's Germany defeats France. France falls. And Britain essentially will fight alone against Nazi Germany for the next year. And Nazi Germany and Britain are basically at stalemate. Stalin's plan is probably to backstab Hitler's Germany when he's weak. But Hitler's original plan was to attack Russia after all and get that continent-sized country. So in the summer of 1941, Hitler's Germany invades Russia, and Stalin is betrayed by Hitler. And Stalin doesn't panic, he doesn't run away from Moscow, but he does everything he can to make sure that Russia is going to win this war. He wants allies, he doesn't want Japan to fight against Russia. Japan in 1940 had signed an alliance with Nazi Germany, so he was going to make sure that Japan, who is in the war against China, isn't going to use the extra resources that they've got to fight against Russia. So what's the only other country that Japan is going to be able to go to war with? And that country is the United States. So this leads to the US. So the US, after the Great Depression in 1929, you have Hoover, who tries to do something at the tail end of his presidency, but it's too little too late. And Roosevelt is elected in 1932, and he becomes, he basically does eventually what Hitler does in 1933. And that is to, pump money into the economy, right? You do all the public works projects. You give people old age pensions. You give people what do you call it? Jobs, government jobs, right? So in Hitler's case, he did the Volkswagen and the Autobahn. He did the conscription and all that, and German unemployment plummeted, and that's how he got popular and reelected. In America's case, FDR does something similar. He does, the public works projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and all these other alphabet soup programs to get the American people working again, and it keeps Roosevelt popular as well. But in the US doesn't get out of the Great Depression as quickly. The United States makes a mistake. Once Roosevelt thinks that the economy is mending, he actually tries to go back to a balanced budget. This actually throws the US economy back into a depression. But more importantly, by this point, something bigger is happening, and that's war. Germany starts the war in Europe in 1939. Japan starts the war in China in 1937. When Germany starts the war in 1939, American public opinion is opposed to entering another war. The American public opinion knows what happened in World War I. They are not stupid. Many people think that World War I happened because there were war profiteers and there were these bankers who wanted to make sure that they got their money back. And they're adamant that they don't want to go to war again. But when Hitler wins against France, and it looks like Britain is teetering on the brink, Roosevelt basically says, look, come on, we gotta go to war. Nazi Germany is a fascist dictatorship, and Britain is the birthplace of parliamentary democracy. We can't let Britain fall to a fascist dictatorship. And Roosevelt begins to aid Britain in large with weapons. It's called Lend-Lease, right? And he wants to get involved in the war, but he can't because popular opinion is against the war. So how do you get involved in the war? And this is where Roosevelt's intentions and the Soviets' intentions basically match. If Germany and Japan are stupid enough to be allies, then what the US can do is the US can get Japan to be pissed off at the US and Japan to throw the first punch so that the US can enter the war and help Britain. And that is precisely what happens. So in Japan, as Germany starts the war in Europe in 1939 and Japan is fighting the war in China, there are two opinions on what to do. One opinion is we should be faithful allies to Germany and help Germany. And the other opinion is, screw Germany, we should be focused more on our own interests. And this comes to a real head in summer of 1941. When Germany invades Russia, Japan's got a choice. Japan can also invade Russia and help Germany out, or Japan can go to Southeast Asia and get the oil reserves, get the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. Now, why are the Japanese divided like this? This is because Roosevelt, to piss the Japanese off, basically joins with China to create what is called the ABCD blockade by the Japanese. ABCD because American, British, Chinese, Dutch blockade. America, Britain, China, and the Dutch East Indies, the oil from the Dutch East, will no longer sell their products to Japan. And the most important product is oil. Oil from Texas, oil from the Dutch East Indies will no longer come to Japan. If there's no oil, you're not going to get your tanks to move, you're not going to get your airplanes to move, and you're not going to get your battleships to move. So the Japanese are stuck, right? They know that the oil is available in Southeast Asia. So here, let's show you a map. Let me do a stop share screen. So map, World War II, Asia. So this is the Dutch East Indies. The oil fields are here, and this is Japan. If Japan is going to send ships and take over the Dutch East Indies and get its oil here and go back and forth like this, the Philippines, which is right here, is in the way. If you are the Japanese military, ask yourself this question. When you send ships from Japan to the Dutch East Indies, after you take over the Dutch East Indies and declare war on Holland, and take over the Dutch East Indies, will the United States, after signing the ABCD blockade, just sit by and watch Japanese ships go back and forth ferrying the oil? And if you think no, and I personally think yes, the US ships will probably just sit idle because American popular opinion was that opposed to entering the war. But if you think no, and a lot of the Japanese leaders thought no, then what you got to do is you got to neutralize the American presence in the Philippines. The French presence in Indochina had already been neutralized in early 1941, which basically made America and Britain and Holland think, oh, if Japan's going to take over here, then Japan might take over our other colonies. So that's part of the reason why the ABCD blockade starts. But the other reason why it starts is because Roosevelt wants to instigate war with Japan, right? So you stop selling oil to Japan. But anyway, if you want to get this oil, that means you got to knock out the American troops here. If you're going to fire on American troops in the Philippines, that means you are declaring war on the United States. If you're declaring war on the United States, then you might as well attack the largest US naval base in the Pacific. And the largest US naval base in the Pacific is Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. And that's why the Pearl Harbor attack is going to happen. But before the Pearl Harbor attacks happen, there is a last-ditch series of negotiations between the US and Japan. Right? Japan wants the US to lift the embargo and sell oil once again. So the last set of negotiations is held between the United States and Japan, and the US Secretary of State is called Cordell Hull. And Cordell Hull, with Roosevelt's blessing, sends what is called the Hull Note to Japan. And the Hull Note says, the US will lift its embargo to Japan if Japan withdraws all its troops from China. And from Japan's perspective, there is like, what? We've been fighting since 1940. This is now 4 years later. We can't just leave China with getting nothing. We have to actually get something out of this. And they said, this is tantamount to declaration of war. We got no choice. We got to go to war. And Japan goes to war against the United States. How is the Soviet Union involved in all this? Here we go. There is a Soviet spy called Richard Zorge. Richard Zorge was a German dude who was a communist, but he pretends to be a Nazi and joins the Nazi party and is actually acting as a Soviet spy. And Richard Zorge then goes from Europe to China, and then from China to Japan. When he gets to Japan, Richard Zorge makes contact with what's his name? The Japanese spy. Here, let me type this in. It's Ozaki Hotsumi. That's the guy's name. This guy here. Richard Zorge comes in contact with Ozaki Hotsumi here. His name is spelled this way, Ozaki Hotsumi. Hotsumi Ozaki. Ozaki is family name. This is Richard Zorge. And Ozaki Hotsumi was the advisor to the Prime Minister of Japan at the time. And Ozaki Hotsumi had managed to convince the Prime Minister of Japan, and not that hard really, that Japan should go to Southeast Asia, knowing full well that this would actually be ultimately lead to war against the United States. And in the short run, it would mean that Japanese troops in China and Manchuria would not go to Russia. So Richard Zorge then sends that information to Russia. And when Stalin gets the information from Richard Zorge from Ozaki Hotsumi via Richard Zorge that Japan is going to go to Southeast Asia, Stalin feels this relief and realizes, oh, okay, so even though the Germans have invaded us from, has betrayed us and invaded us from, Poland, what we can do is we can pull the Russian troops from Manchuria and send them all to the Western Front to fight against the Germans. And to put the final nail in the coffin, you have this guy, Harry Dexter White, who is the Undersecretary of the Treasury, who drafted the initial note for Cordell Hull. Now, I don't know why the Undersecretary of Treasury is drafting the initial note for the Undersecretary of the State, but Harry Dexter White was in close contact with Alger Hiss, who was also a Soviet spy. Well, I mean, I don't know if he was in close contact, but Alger Hiss was a Soviet spy. Harry Dexter White was a Soviet spy. Alger Hiss was in the State Department. Harry Dexter White was in the Treasury Department, and they're both serving FDR. And the important point is Harry Dexter White's proposal eventually becomes solidified as the Hull Note, and that goes to Japan, and it starts the war between the US and Japan. And Stalin now knows for sure that Japan is completely locked. Japan is now completely locked in, and that Japan will have no ability whatsoever to intervene in Russia, and Stalin can focus all his efforts on fighting against Nazi Germany. So here's the thing. What I want to say is that whether it's World War I or World War II, to try to think that there's the good guys and bad guys is wrong. Trying to think that there's good guys and bad guys is basically to fall into the trap and thinking like, not it's a trap, but it's an easy way to think about it if you are nationalistic. And because education all over the world, wherever you go, is fundamentally nationalistic, this is something that's very easily done. Now, I'm not saying we should be cosmopolitan. I don't think that's possible. And I don't think we can actually drop our nationalism. None of us can. Because nationalism ultimately comes out of patriotism, which is love for your land, right? But when you do history, we should try and not think about it in those terms of our side and their side. We should try and think about it as objectively as possible. And what I can say is that whether it was World War I or World War II, the thing that was really bad was the fact that we didn't know how to use capitalism well. Right? We didn't know how to use capitalism well, and that's why World War I started. We didn't realize that we should be paying our workers more, and that caused this scramble for these colonies, and ultimately this competition for the colonies led to this crazy alliance structure, and that led to that massive war, which was World War I. When World War I was finally over and the other countries basically picked up the pieces and tried to put the world together, it looked like it was going to work, but when the Great Depression started, instead of saying, hey, all the capitalist countries should trade with each other with free trade, and the stronger parts should pull up the weaker parts, the United States and Britain said, screw you to the rest of the world, and had isolationist policies, and that basically made the depression that started in America global, and every single capitalist country suffered. Every single capitalist industrial country suffered. So, that's bad. And then when that happens, it's not exactly surprising then that you have countries like Germany and also countries like Japan that basically say, well, if that's the case, then we have to have our own empire too. The Germans think that they can get their empire in Russia, and the Japanese feel that their empire should be in Manchuria and China. Right? If Great Britain has Canada, India, and Australia, well, and if America has that continental-sized country, the Japanese think, well, isn't it fair that we get China, Manchuria and China? Now, I mean, if you say yes to that, then you're buying into a logic of Japanese imperialism. But if you just stop for a moment and think about this, right? Think of it from the perspective of the Chinese. Right? It's like, huh? What? It's like, why do we have to pay for your problems, right? I mean, obviously that's not true. But and what happens is when these wars happen, all sides try to justify why they're doing this and that they're doing this for a good deed. Now, what's interesting is that the Nazis actually don't say that. The Nazis are actually very clear and that they're doing this specifically for the sake of Germany, and they don't care about the rest of the world. There's no altruistic motives. Spoken like a true fascist there. They think war itself is good. But, the United States and Britain, they get together and they create the Atlantic Charter. The idea behind the Atlantic Charter is that they're fighting so that the world is going to be free, and that the world will be free from, fascist dictatorships, and that there will be a capitalism in the world. Is this really true? My answer to you is, did any of the colonies in Africa and Asia become independent after World War II? And since you know that the answer is no, right? You know that that's actually BS, right? This is just lip service to try to get the countries that are already independent on the side of Britain and France. African colonies did not gain independence until the 1960s and 70s. And Asian countries, like India, for example, was able to gain independence in 1947 only because the Indians kicked the British out effectively, right? It's not because the British said, hey, you know what, war's over, 1945, war's over, we made a promise, so we're leaving India now. It's like, that didn't happen. If they could stay, they stayed as long as they can. So like Malaysia, for example, they stayed to the 1960s. All right, so what did the Japanese say? Well, the Japanese said that we are creating a new order in East Asia, Asia for Asians. We are going to kick out the Western imperialists. So the war that they fight is a war against American imperialism in Philippines, against Dutch imperialism in Dutch East Indies, and French imperialism in French Indochina, and British imperialism in Burma and Malaysia and Singapore. Is this true? Wow. I mean, come on. They fought against China. That in of itself goes, and the other thing you can say is, yes, during World War II, they actually did make Burma and the Philippines independent. That's true. But strategic locations like Singapore, strategic locations like Dutch Indonesia, which produced oil, those places did not gain independence under Japanese rule. What happened is, as the Japanese were losing in August of 1945, they went to the Vietnamese and the Indonesians and said, oh, look, come on. It looks like we're losing. And once we lose, the Westerners are going to come back and they're going to try and make you guys colonies. And we pay lip service to it. And some of us actually believe that lip service, so should declare independence now. And just as the Japanese were being defeated, Vietnam and Indonesia declares independence. And on what the Western intentions were was actually true, because once Japan was defeated, the United States helps the French and the Dutch come back to Vietnam and Indonesia. So, people talk about altruistic motives and, we're the good guys because we believe in freedom. Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to believe that. I don't believe any of that. I'm not cosmopolitan. I'm not naive enough to say that, the entire world is one country. That's just insane. But I'm also not naive enough to believe in, the nationalistic propaganda both sides have. So World War I has passed, 100 years have passed World War I. Most people now know what propaganda is and what propaganda isn't. So a lot of the atrocities that the Germans, it's said that the Germans perpetrated, for example, in Belgium during World War I, we know that most of it is propaganda and false. Right? So during World War II, there was a lot of propaganda made by the US that the Japanese are evil, and there was a lot of propaganda made by Japan that the US is evil. Well, the propaganda that Japan made basically went nowhere because Japan lost the war, but because the US won the war, the propaganda that the US made that Japan is evil kind of stuck and is still there. But the Japanese Empire is it's like the British Empire. It's no less evil, no more evil than the British Empire. Now, if there is one empire that was evil, I would argue that that's probably Nazi Germany. And that's because Nazi Germany did a particular crime that's heinous, which is genocide. Their goal was intentionally to wipe out a group of people simply because of who they were. Japan never did that. The British never did that, right? So, the Germans actually, not the Germans, the Nazis actually tried to wipe out the Jews. And it wasn't just the Germans, but the rest of Europe also helped in doing that, right? So the French government actually collaborated with the Nazis and sent French Jews to the concentration camps. The same can be said of the various countries in Eastern Europe. And if you go towards the further east, it was like really, really brutal, where they would just start killing Jews even before the Nazis arrived. Um, so that was pretty bad. Although in terms of like total number being killed, Stalin may have killed more people than Hitler. But we'll put that aside. And Mao killed more people than Stalin. So, communists killed more people than fascists. But the communists, yeah, I can't defend communists for killing people like that. I suppose what you could say is they actually had the goal of, rapid industrialization, and they didn't care about the human cost. And in that sense, they're evil. They're probably, one notch less evil than Nazi Germany, but that's pretty evil, where you just don't care about people's death left and right. Uh, on that grand scale. But anyway, so there you go. That's World War II. So how does this all end? And then we'll end with that. World War II ends in Europe because ultimately the Russians defeat the Germans. I know Hollywood likes to depict the fact that the United States did everything to end the Nazis' threat, but that is not the case. The bulk of the war in World War II is fought in the East between Germany and Russia. And even if D-Day had failed, the Russians would have steamrolled over Germany, and then they would have kept going, and the Russians would have been in Paris. It would have been like 1815 when there were Russian troops in Paris when Napoleon was defeated. That's probably what would have happened. In the Pacific, on the other hand, the country that defeated Japan is the United States. The war is a war between the US Navy and the Japanese Navy. And when the Japanese Navy lost, the war was over. Japan lost that war because of the US Navy. Right. I mean, the U.S. Army fought, in the Pacific as well, but so the U.S. won the war against Japan. Okay. In the East, because of D-Day, American forces and British forces come from the West, and Russian forces come from the East, and Germany gets divided into East Germany and West Germany. Or technically speaking, West Germany is there's three parts. There's the American occupation zone, the British occupation zone, and the French occupation zone. And East Germany is simply the Russian occupation zone. Okay, so how does the war end in the Pacific? Here we go. The Japanese army, the bulk of it is stuck in China, that is true. But they actually do manage to rampage through Southeast Asia. And when smaller numbers of Japanese troops defeat larger numbers of Western troops in the various colonies, this actually makes a big shift this actually marks a big shift in thinking for the people in Southeast Asia. So for countries like, Indonesia, the Philippines, for a long time, the myth was white supremacy. For a long time, the myth was white people are superior, brown people are inferior, and that's the reason why, white people are ruling over us as colonial masters. Right? White people are superior and colored people are inferior. Well, when the Japanese come in December of 1941, and basically defeat all the Western powers, whether from the Philippines to the Netherlands to Singapore to Burma, all these people basically look at that and go, "Oh, wait, hang on. What was all that about white supremacy? That's BS. The Japanese aren't white. They're yellow. They're colored just like us. So what this means is it's not color of your skin. It's who's got guns, right? If you got the right guns, if you got the right technology, then you can fight wars and you can win. And this actually eliminates, to a large extent, the sense that we're inferior, the racist concept that we're inferior. And in Asia, racism ends a lot quicker because of Japan. And this is, one of the weird things that Japan does that's actually beneficial. Okay. So where did I get to? So Japan conquers all this, but the U.S. then comes and starting in December, Japan conquers all this. But starting in 1942, the U.S. starts its counterattack. So Midway is here, and in summer of 1942 is the Battle of Midway. Sometimes this is seen as the turning point of World War II in Pacific, but this is actually wrong. The Battle of Midway is the first major Allied victory against Japan. The Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers and the US loses 1 aircraft carrier. So it's the first major Allied victory, but it's not the turning point. The turning point happens here in Guadalcanal, which, see if I can get this bigger. Here it is, in the Solomon Islands. The turning point here happens here in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The war movie that talks about this is The Thin Red Line, so I recommend watching that movie if you want to know more about it. But basically from the summer of 1942, August 1942, all the way until February of 1943, is a 6-month-long slog battle over the island of Guadalcanal. And the US and Japan throw everything they've got to take over Guadalcanal. They throw ships, airplanes, pilots, everything, right? So when, the 4 aircraft carriers sunk, people thought that this was the end of the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Air Force, but that wasn't the case because, okay, the ships may have sunk, but the crew can jump and escape, and the airplanes can actually land on water, and the pilots can then jump out of the airplanes and be fished out, and they can go back and fight another day. And that's precisely what happened. But in Guadalcanal, because of this battle, both sides basically ground. It was like a meat grinder. Both sides threw everything they've got, and the pilots and the ships got ground, to a pulp in Guadalcanal. Now the difference is the U.S. could afford the losses. The US had a population of 100 million and had a much larger industrial base. Japan had only a population of 70 million and it had a much smaller industrial base. And so Japan could not match the production that the US could make. And when Japan lost in Guadalcanal, that was the turning point. From this point onwards, Japan would never be able to go on the offensive and the US will be on the offensive. And the US would basically in 1943, rest of 43, fight here in the Solomon Islands, and then in 1944 fight here and East Indies, and then in 1945 they'll be fighting here. By March of 1945, these islands have fallen, and when these islands fall, so like Iwo Jima, when these islands fall, what happens is they're now in range to bomb Japan. So the Japanese leadership during World War II can be grouped into 3 major groups. One is the civilian leaders, right? The other group is the Navy leaders. The third group is the Army leaders. By 1943, the Navy leaders actually knew that the war was lost. And by 44, they're saying, we got to figure out a way to surrender and end this war because we can't win. By spring of 1945, starting in March of 1945, as Japanese cities get firebombed by American bombers, the civilian leaders now know the war is lost, right? They know that the war is over, it's gone. The Army leaders, on the other hand, say, what are you talking about? We have our troops here in Manchuria and China. We don't need to give up. Why? Why should we give up? What we're going to do is we're going to bring all our troops in Manchuria and China back to Japan, and we will fight one climactic battle against the Americans. And because we brought back all our troops, we will be able to have more troops in Japan than what the Americans can bring over. And when that happens, we will win. And when Japan wins, we can then talk about a ceasefire. That is the plan of the Japanese army. All right, so that's March of 1945 as the cities are being firebombed. In May of 1945, Germany surrenders. The Russians occupy Berlin and Germany surrenders. Stalin had made a secret agreement with Roosevelt that after Germany surrenders, the Russian troops will move east and they will attack Japan to help in the war effort against Japan because Russia is an ally of America. So Stalin begins to bring troops towards the east. By August of 1945, Japan is still fighting desperately. The Battle of Okinawa has happened, and huge numbers of casualties have been calculated on both American and Japanese sides. All right, this is really, really bad. And the Russians are about to enter the war. But the American leaders think about this, and they go, hang on. The US fought against Japan starting in December of 41, 42, 1943, 1944, up to August of 1945. That is 4 years and 9 months of war against Japan. Almost 5 years. The Russians are going to enter the war against Japan, and they're probably going to knock out Japan in like a month. And after the war is over, just like Germany, the Russians will get half of Japan. We will be able to explain this to the American public, that we fight the war and we beat Japan and we get only half of Japan, and the Russians enter the war and they only fight for like a month and they get half of Japan. And the American leaders basically think of this, yeah, I don't think we can explain this. And Truman, this is probably one of his main consideration things. In order to end this war as quickly as possible, before the Russians enter the war, the US decides to drop 2 atomic bombs. 1 bomb in Hiroshima and then 1 bomb in Nagasaki. The Russians, when they hear that the bombs are dropped, decide to enter the war as soon as they can, and they start to invade Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. They actually invade ahead of schedule because they hear about this. They clearly want a piece of Japan. Okay. What does the Japanese leadership say? Here's the scary part. When they hear that the nuclear bomb has been dropped in Hiroshima, the army leadership's position is, we've already lost so many cities to firebombings by the Americans. What's 1 extra city? It's no big deal. Now, obviously, they didn't know the full scale and the horror of the bomb, but they said, it's no big deal. We can keep on fighting, which is like kind of insane. But when they hear that the Russians have invaded, they basically go, oh, it's the end of the war. Because what happens is those troops in China and Manchuria can now no longer be brought back to Japan. They will be fighting against the Russians. And not only that, even worse, 1 week after the Russian invasion, the Japanese army in Manchuria is destroyed. The Japanese army in Manchuria was supposed to be the best army that they had. But by 1945, it was like a shadow of its old self. And in 1 week, it gets destroyed. And when it no longer has the pieces to be able to bring back Japan to fight that climactic war against the United States, the Japanese army leadership realizes, okay, the war is lost. And that's why Japan surrenders on August 15th, 1945, right? 1 week after the bombs drop, because the first bomb drops, the Russians enter, the second bomb drops, the Russians annihilate the Japanese army, Japan surrenders. Now, generally speaking, most people believe that the atomic bombs ended the war. Why do most people believe that the atomic bombs ended the war? That is because the American propaganda basically went in and said the atomic bombs ended the war. And the Japanese propaganda also said the atomic bombs ended the war. When the Japanese surrender, they do not mention the Russians whatsoever. Why? Because if Japan had ever mentioned the reason why they surrendered, there's a good chance that the Russians would demand a part of Japan. And the Japanese leadership, whether it was the civilian leaders or the army leaders or the navies, every single one of them agreed that it's certainly better to have private property under the capitalist Americans than to get rid of all private property under the Russians. So that's the reason why the war comes to an end, and that's the reason why many people think that the atomic bombs were dropped. So the atomic bombs were dropped not because of a military necessity, but because of a political calculation. The atomic bombs were dropped for that reason. If you think in terms of military necessity, there was actually no need to drop the bombs, and you can read MacArthur or Nimitz, the chief, the chief, the U.S. Navy, right, the head of the U.S. Navy, or Eisenhower, right, the guy in command of the American forces in Europe. Almost all the top American military leaders agreed that we didn't need to use, the U.S. didn't need to use the atomic bomb on Japan. Why? Well, think about it. I think this is Eisenhower's idea. What you can do is you can just surround Japan and blockade it. That's all you gotta do. Japan doesn't produce oil. The oil is here. You blockade Japan and you don't get the oil from here, their ships, their airplanes, nothing moves, and the war will be over. Japan's gonna surrender. That's it. That's one reason. Another reason is was the more diabolical plan. Even if we are afraid of casualties, if the US is afraid of casualties because of invasions in Okinawa and the various islands near the Japanese home islands, and the Japanese resist like crazy, and there might be 1 million casualties, well, okay, the US Navy will do the blockade and we'll let the Russians invade Japan. Stalin doesn't care about casualties. If we just care about casualties, let Stalin take the casualties. So there was that plan. And then there was obviously the third plan, which was said by American diplomats. And the American diplomats said, look, the reason why the Japanese aren't surrendering is because they don't want to surrender unconditionally. They want to make sure that the emperor is going to stay in place. They don't want Japan to be like World War I Germany, where Japan goes from being an imperial country with an emperor to a republic. So all we have to do is basically send a note saying, yeah, you guys have to surrender, but you can keep your emperor, and the war will be over. And it turns out that is precisely why Japan surrenders. So after the Russian entry into the war and the military leaders know that they can't win, they basically send a telegram to the US saying, okay, we're willing to surrender. What are the terms? And the US says, the terms is for the unconditional surrender of Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy. And then Japan replies back to the, what about the emperor? And the US replies to that, the Japanese people can decide on what to do with the emperor. So Japan surrenders, but it's a surrender of the Japanese army and the Japanese navy that surrenders unconditionally. And when the Japanese leaders hear this, they go, okay, we can live with this. We know that the Japanese people will not overthrow the emperor and we will not become a republic, so we can take this deal. And that's why on August 15th, Japan surrenders. And true to their word and true to, so the US expected that the Japanese people would probably overthrow the emperor and become a republic, just like, Imperial Germany. But as the Japanese, leaders knew, that did not happen. When the war was over, and the emperor said that he wanted to go on a tour of Japan and say to the Japanese people, that we have suffered, and he wants to see the Japanese people and pay homage to them and all that. The American government, the American occupation authorities were like, oh, perfect, send the emperor to various parts of Japan, rocks will be thrown at him and he will abdicate and Japan will become a republic. Perfect, go. And that did not happen, right? So Japan's got a completely different history from Germany and having an emperor, so that's probably why. And that's actually more pre-modern history. But the point is, World War I and World War II, from 1914 to 1945, this 30-year period that's really, really bad. And we can talk about all the bad things that happen, right? So one of the bad things that happened was, of course, the rapid increase in military technology. So Submarine warfare, the people who start that is the Germans, but the people who perfect that is the US. Aircraft carriers and airplane warfare, the people who start that is the Japanese, and people who perfect that is also the US. Tanks, right? The people who start that are the British, and the people who perfect that are the Russians. The Germans start rocket warfare. They launched the V2 rocket. It's the modern rocketry, right? Poison gas. The poison gas is actually started by both the French and the Germans. It's so bad that in World War II it was banned. The nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon was developed by the US, and then eventually, because there's all these spies in the US, the Soviets get nuclear weapons. Biological weapons. The Japanese developed biological weapons in Manchuria. This is the infamous Unit 731. Oh, and God. So, the reason why I was like that was because here's the story what happens to Unit 731. When the war is over, there is going to be a war crimes tribunal. And the war crimes tribunal is divided into three categories: Category A, Category B, and Category C. You sort of think that Category A should be the most important, but I don't think Category A is actually that important. Category A is crimes against peace, which doesn't make any sense because it's a category that means that you have conspired to start wars and conspired to overthrow governments. If you use that Category A thing, then most American presidents after World War II would be Category A war criminals. So I don't really believe that. War itself is something that doesn't go away. So the more important crime are Category B and Category C: crimes against humanity and crimes, ordinary war crimes. Crimes against humanity is, the crimes that the Germans were tried at Nuremberg for, killing all those Jews. Right? You can't do that, right? So that's a crime against humanity. Ordinary war crimes are killing civilians, killing prisoners of war, mistreating prisoners of war, and you can't do that either. So people who do, B and C class war crimes are the people who really should be punished, so that the kind of crap doesn't happen again. And Unit 731 is actually something that should belong in Category B or Category C. It's clearly a crime against humanity or a crime against peace, right? By the way, bombing cities is a crime against humanity, or is a war crime because you're killing innocent civilians. The Japanese in Asia started by attacking China. The Germans started it first by attacking London. But in reverse, Britain bombs German cities, the US bombs German cities, and the US bombs Japanese cities. So if you're going to punish people for that, you got to punish British and American leaders who, put that into place and said, go do it and burn cities. But anyway, that didn't happen. And more importantly, Unit 731, right, this unit that committed war crimes by doing human experimentation to create biological weapons. The gory stuff about the human experimentation is probably propaganda, but we do know, because I have read the US government documents on Unit 731, we do know that they actually did human experimentation to see if they can weaponize the bubonic plague and various other diseases. That part is true. So there's all vivisection and all that kind of nonsense. I don't really buy that too much, but by Unit 731. But I do know that they did experiment to see if people could get biological weapons. And weaponize diseases. And they actually tried it in China, and I'm really, really glad that it failed, because diseases don't care who you are. Once it spreads, it just kills people left and right. So, it's almost exactly like the story of the nuclear bomb. The US thought that the Germans were about to build the nuclear bombs, so we did the Manhattan Project. And once the nuclear bombs were built, even though the initial plan was to use the nuclear bombs only in retaliation if the Germans used it first, once it was built, the temptation to use it could not be held in, and ultimately it was used. It was used as a political weapon, but it was also probably used as a test. The Japanese thought that the Russians were making a biological weapon, and so they said, we got to make biological weapons just in case the Russians use biological weapons against us. And once the biological weapon was completed, they could not resist the urge to use it. And so that's why you have the start of biological weapons. So nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, right? US, Japan, Germany, and France. Yeah, I know. Anyway, what happened to this unit? Here's what happened. When the war was over and Unit 731 was being, hunted down to be tried for war crimes, the U.S. military goes to who was the chief of Unit 731 and says, you know what? We are too moral to actually do these experiments, but if you hand over all the data, we're not going to try you for war crimes. And what did Unit 731 leader do? He handed over the data, and he was never tried for war crimes. It's like, this is what I mean, right? You can't do that kind of crap. We would like to think that World War I, World War II is a war between good guys and bad guys. After 100 years, not many people think that World War I was a war between good guys and bad guys. But World War II, people still think that it's a war between good guys and bad guys. I really don't see how you can say World War II is a war between good guys and bad guys. This whole period from 1914 to 1945, it was basically a big giant screw up because people didn't know how to react when capitalism goes bad. And we learned from that mistake. The most important lesson we learned is, hey, don't gyp your workers. Pay your workers a fair share. The other very important lesson we learned is that when one country has a major crisis, don't shut yourself off. Have more free trade and talk to the rest of the world and help out. And this was actually applied in 2007 when the Wall Street crash happened, and we thought that it was going to be a Great Depression once again. The US government basically bailed out the banks to make sure that the banks don't completely collapse, which I'm in favor of. I am completely against the way we bailed out the banks, but we'll put that aside. So you bail out the banks, and then instead of walling off and having isolationism, you talk to the rest of the world and say, hey, let's have more free trade so that the healthier parts of the world's economy can help out. And in 2007, 2008, in that case, China stepped up to the plate. Right? The Chinese economy by that point was the second largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And they said, instead of being a neo-mercantilist state that tries to sell more than buy, we will actually try to encourage domestic consumption, and we will try to balance our trade. And, China tried to help fuel global international economy. And although we had the Great Recession, we did not have the Great Depression. And the countries didn't suddenly become antagonistic, thinking we have to basically just look out for ourselves because nobody can't trust anybody else, and we got to look out for ourselves. So that's it for now. It's been a long lecture, I know, but this is a pretty depressing story. But good news, the Cold War is also kind of depressing, but the big story behind the Cold War actually is a lesson from all this, and we actually escape a major conflict with the US and the Soviet Union. And another thing that we have to talk about is the various other countries around the world that had to choose what kind of economy they had, or what kind of political economy they had. All right, so that's it for now, and I will see you around. Have a good one.